Welcome to Ames Public Library for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through inclusive resources and programs like today's event. We invite you to join us for future programs, which you can learn about through our current issue of Page One or by signing up for our events email. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the program ends. For those of you joining us online, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit those via the chat, and I'll make sure that those get asked at an appropriate time. If you get bumped out of today's Zoom event, just follow that original link and you should be able to get right back in. And with that, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Paul Lasley.
Am I on? Can you hear? Does that sound okay? Put this in my pocket then. Well, it's always nice to come down and share some ideas with this group. Today, I want to really talk about the importance of photographs or pictures and faces in telling your story. The whole debate about who we are is really oftentimes phrased in terms of nature versus nurture and who we are. So I know you're, as genealogists, you've been tracing your roots. You've been tracking the nature part, the genetic part of ancestry and ethnicity and race and lineage. Genealogy's taken a big leap forward in recent years with the genetic testing. So now with Ancestry.com and 23andMe, and there's about a dozen companies that can actually do the genetic testing. You can find relatives that at least you're genetically related to. And most genealogists go through family history looking at ancestors based on birth records. And so that's the whole nature thing. But another important part of who we are revolves around the life situations, the conditions that we were raised in, and the nurturing part. And certainly we know that there's a strong interaction between nature and nurture and what factors. We've all seen young people, children develop that had lots of intelligence, had good stock, we'd say, good genes, but because of life circumstance and situations, sometimes they fail to thrive. We blame it on home life or community life, or maybe it's because they have a disability, they're picked on or they're being bullied. We all know that this nature versus nurture is important. So I'm going to focus on primarily on the nurturing part and the importance of documenting who you are. And as you pass on your genealogical records to those that follow, they need to understand the environment that their ancestors lived in, you and previous generations. What were the living conditions that shaped who we are? And so a couple of slides on disclaimers, trying to predict the future. When I'm right, no one remembers, but if I'm wrong, no one forgets. After 40 years on the faculty at Iowa State, I kind of learned that it only takes one mistake. So a little bit of caveat, but what you're attempting to do in documenting genealogy is hopefully that people will remember. One of the other observations about genealogy is that every generation believes they live in the most rapidly changing period of history. And I will show you some examples, and I really question. I hear people say, oh, this technological change, things are happening so fast, it's hard to keep up. Well, I'll show you some pictures to suggest that maybe It's our perception of that change when we look at some photographs that I brought along on the living conditions of our ancestors. A final note is a central problem of our time is that the future is not what it used to be. And so I want to talk a bit about the future in terms of how do we pass on our interest in genealogy to our children and grandchildren and the generations that follow us. Looking back on the versus looking forward. Now, I happen to be much better at discussing the past than forecasting the future, and genealogists have historically looked backwards at previous generations. So I want to suggest that we have two roles to play, not only documenting the past, but making some assessments of where this leads us in the future. So I've got some pictures that I hope will inspire you to include photographs or images, maybe not of your own ancestors, because pictures are hard to find, especially in those early days, the settlement period. But I'm going to talk about these pictures in terms of what was the message or messages of a picture such as this. So if you focus carefully on that picture, I apologize, the lighting is not so very good, but it appears to me that we have two brothers in this picture, two adult men and their wives and their children. Now you can see it in front of a big farmstead, probably a pretty typical 1900 farmstead. And unfortunately, you can't see it. But right here is a dead turkey. So I'm assuming that this was a gathering of the family to kill the Thanksgiving turkey. Or at least, so if you look carefully, but this begins to tell us something about who these people are. If you look in the upstairs window, you notice the windows are open and there's no screens on the. Think about the living conditions in where your ancestors were raised without air conditioning, the need to rely on, and fortunately this house has a lot of trees that helped a little bit. You can't see in the picture, but you also see a clothesline right off the front porch, a wire from the porch to that tree, which again, these are small things, but it begins to paint a picture of the lifestyle that many of our ancestors lived. Now, there actually was a study done in Cedar County, Iowa in 1910, in which they surveyed both all the farm households, whether they were owned or rented. And here's some numbers from 1910 study. 80% of the homes had screens. That was a significant improvement. That also means 20% let the flies come in through the windows and doors. 94% had a cellar or basement, important for food storage, food processing. A third had modern heating systems. That means 70% did not. Only 1 in 5 had running water in 1910. About the same number had a bathtub or indoor toilets. Only 20% had electricity or gas. 91% did not have a telephone. That's a typo. 10% had telephones in 1910. It was only with the rural electrification project of the New Deal era did that happen. Yeah, Pete.
Define a modern heating system.
You know, the study, I looked at it, I think what they were talking about is something that would burn coal and would have ductwork to heat the upstairs. Some of you will remember those old two-story farmhouses did not have heating units upstairs. You lived in what?
Haven't registered, but
They had an opening, didn't they? It was a hole in the floor. It was covered with a grate, and hopefully some warm air would rise to heat those rooms. And I've heard others talk about, I did not live in that big a house, so we didn't have an upstairs. But if you had a bucket of water upstairs, there'd be ice in it in the morning. So it probably wasn't all that fish. I think that's what they meant. When you look at this, in this particular study, they looked at what role did farm women do outside of the house. And there's not a surprise, but what I'm trying to do is try to think for you, to stimulate you to describe to your children and grandchildren, and in your case, great-great-grandchildren, how it was like growing up on a farm without heat, or what their grandmothers did as farm women, taking care of chickens, taking care of the garden, lesser milking cows, working in the field. These are images of the nurturing part of genealogy. Now, 96% had gardens. We're the generation that most of us know what gardening is. Do our grandchildren or great-grandchildren? You know, I can still remember, and I'm sure you can remember, the work that had to be done in tending to gardens. Pulling weeds was my specialty. Well, or at least that's what I was told to do. But 84% had lawns or a grass plot, which actually I was a little surprised about. Some had sidewalks. About 9 in 10 had shrubs or trees. 51% had flower beds. And perhaps you remember flower beds of your youth that your mothers or grandmothers. These are some of the things. Now, this study also interviewed the women and recorded their conversations. And here's some statements that some of the farm women made. We're too far from a town to belong to a lodge or anything like that. The issue of social isolation of farm women. I wish we had some way to get acquainted. We need some spirit in this community. Farmers are not as sociable and sympathetic of each other's needs as they should be. We have no social life here, have no time to get into anything, haven't even any neighbors. Now, I don't want to go too far afield, but I wonder how many of these statements are true today. You recall The Bridges of Madison County, the book and the movie. One of the complaints of the wife featured in that movie was social isolation, living out in the country, not having neighbors. When I read about farm consolidation and the outmigration of rural Iowa, I think we'd find a number of people, especially women, saying the social life and social isolation here is a problem. And they didn't have phones, and the social media did not exist. So we'll come to that, but thank you. So here's another picture that tells a bit of a story that is an important part of who we are without transportation. There's the Uber right there, the white horse and the buggy. That appears to be the parents and their 2 daughters in the background. So through images, we can begin to at least capture the lifestyle of living in the Midwest that forms who we are. Some pictures now of women actually working. This woman is pulling up water, obviously doesn't have indoor plumbing, and she's getting a bucket out of this well. Some of you will remember the washboard. One of the things that always impresses me when I sort through old pictures is the amount of labor, the amount of work. Living without what we call modern conveniences today. So scrubbing clothes in a wash tub with a washboard and a bar of lye soap. So I kind of picked pictures from across the period. This is obviously later because we've got an erect silo there. We're feeding stover and corn to these cattle. What I like about this picture is it's a husband and wife working together. It's very hard to find pictures of farm women working outside of the home because it was not seen as something special. And yet that work activity defined our mothers and grandmothers. A more modern picture, boy, the convenience of electricity and refrigeration. Food preservation became easier, not easy, but easier with electricity and refrigeration. Yes?
Would have been an ice box. We used to go to town and get a block of ice and put in the bottom. That was the refrigeration.
Yep, that's right, exactly. However, most of those ice boxes were oak, wooden boxes, but ice boxes was the refrigeration. But when electricity came, and many of you will remember when your family got electricity or got a freezer. I remember that the entire summer was on canning fruits and vegetables and meat. It was canned because we didn't have but when the deep freeze came, suddenly things got froze as opposed to pressure cookers. But still, a lot of work involved. Raising of chicks. Now this picture, you see, we've got a heater there, and early spring, the woman is bundled up, taking care of these chicks, and again, raising chicks for meat as well as eggs. And there was an entire hatchery industry around delivering poult to farm families. I threw this in because it's a very curious one, because we've got a woman milking a goat. And you can see, again, all these pictures emphasize the hard manual work. Here's a woman driving the grain in. You can see ear corn in that. This becomes, now it's sort of interesting because a lot of farm women weren't allowed to drive or didn't drive, and here's a woman driving a farm tractor. So the evolution of women on the farm. This is actually from the Iowa State College files of 1910. This is domestic economy cooking class. There was a lot of emphasis on food preparation and food safety and handling as we began to learn about proper preservation of foods. I like this picture. You can see these four little kids around a table. You got a cream separator, so they obviously are separating milk with their manually operated food But you can also tell, and actually this picture is from Dorothea Lange, who one of the renowned photographers of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics in the Great Depression, the abject poverty. And being raised in poverty shapes who you are as much as being raised in affluence. How you're raised, the conditions that you had, that you existed in, shape the opportunities for upward mobility. Too often we think of pictures like this, mom and dad and the kids playing around a board game. When in fact, many kids were raised like this. Or here we have, it looks like probably a grandmother playing a board game. I watch my grandchildren, and I'm not sure they understand what board games are. They have lots of computers and tablets and gizmos, but our generation often was entertained by board games or reading. Now I know this is an audience of readers. This appears that the dad is reading the farm journal, mom is reading a book to the little girl, and the young boy there got a book in his lap, although he seems to be the pictures that supplement the nature part. So this is a nurturing part of who we are, our aspirations for education, for learning, for playing musical instruments. Where did those values come from? Why did you learn to play an instrument, whether it's a piano or a flute or banjo or a fiddle? I did an interview yesterday with Iowa News, or with ISU News Service, and that's what they wanted. They kept pushing me. Well, why do you have this passion for fiddles? Where did this come from? Why do you collect fiddles? And it boils down to the upbringing that I had and the opportunities that I had. I told the interviewer yesterday, this is a 1905 pump organ that belonged to my grandmother, and several years ago I restored it. But as a little boy, my first music lessons was on this organ, and my grandmother was a large farm wife. They lived in an unair-conditioned house. I was probably 3 or 4. What I do remember is that my legs weren't long enough to reach the pedals, and so I had to sit on my grandmother's lap with her arms around me, placing my fingers on the right keys. I never became an organist, but that was my first music lessons. This picture, while it's, and undoubtedly, you have those same sorts of stories about the importance of how your interest developed because of a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, maybe a minister. Oh, here's a picture of my deep freeze. See, we are now getting quite modern. The deep freeze comes, and while there's still a lot of work involved, it was a lot easier to freeze produce than it was the canning. Yeah, we still have the hard drudgery work of hoeing in a garden. These are pictures that could help supplement your life story or the stories of your ancestors. Reading. This is a newspaper. It looks like a very comfortable chair. Schools. The importance of school in developing who we are. There's still remnants of the one-room country schools across the Midwest, but include stories about what you did as a student. How many of you went to a one-room school? Just one. So the rest of you went to town schools. And I'll bet if I spent the time, I could get a lot of stories about the difference of how country kids or farm kids were treated versus city kids. That was one of the big divides in many of those schools. So this is also from the Iowa State files. This is another home economics class on teaching women tailoring, making their own clothing. Another example from the textiles department. Oftentimes women ended up keeping records, farm records. I think it oftentimes had to do with women maybe had more training, more years of education, and maybe were more clear-eyed about making financial decisions and record keeping. Baking, cleaning the church. These are all stories about that we can blend into who we are by the institutions that we were involved in, whether it was a school or the church or the hospital. The telephones came about, changed a lot, didn't it? This is the old switchboard where you could crank up and at least call a neighbor. Assuming it wasn't long distance. Another picture of a telephone operator. One could do a whole series about when did telephone and electricity come to your community or to your home. Another picture of a church. The men are very proud of this church, and you can see it's got lights made out of local bricks. The importance of churches in the formation of who we are. Another picture, there's still lots of these small country churches in existence. Acquiring vegetables, this certainly doesn't look like the supermarkets of today, but oftentimes there was a connection between the merchant and the customer, something that is missing today, but that oftentimes formed. I remember, and certainly you remember, that oftentimes you could go into the grocery store and buy groceries and put it on an account. Just put it on the account, end of the month. And not only did you put it on an account, when you got ready to pay it off, you used not a personal check, but what was the check where you wrote in the name of the bank and the merchant? A counter check. Gosh, I haven't seen a counter check in years. I'm sure they don't have them anymore. Schools, terribly important. Many of us can single a single teacher or maybe a set of teachers that took an interest in us. That should be part of your genealogical record. Who you are based upon the support you got, whether it's a music teacher, a math teacher, an English teacher. That's part of your story. That's part of who you are, and that story needs to be told to your children and grandchildren. Walking beans. I suspect in this group there are a number of you that have had that experience. It was probably about 1970 or maybe by 80, certainly, walking beans had pretty well disappeared owing to the fact that we control weeds with herbicides. So shifting slightly, look at the pride of this young girl with her ribbon at a corn contest. She's obviously worked hard in getting this corn ready for, I'm going to say, the state fair. I can't read the ribbon, but you can see the pride. That's part of who she is now. I would love to be able to find a person like this and say, was this you at age 14? And I'll bet she remembers. I'll bet she remembers this. Of course, 4-H played a big role in youth development. A number, probably in this group, were members of 4-H. One of my favorite scenes, this, I'm not sure I'm assuming it was at harvest time, and I'm guessing that this was the crew that set out around a big heavy meal, and I can see at least 4 guys in this picture. This probably neighbors helping neighbors. This is the collaboration that occurred. Unfortunately, even yet today, we see a lot of houses where dreams were shattered, the farms went broke, and the family moved on, the land was sold. That's been a legacy for the last 100 years. Now, those of you that know that I was a rural sociologist, my interest has been, how does social change affect people? Much of my career was on the farm crisis of the 1980s, the impact of financial stress on individual and family and community well-being. So when we think about social change, we can talk about the world we live in today is far different than we knew growing up. The only way your children and grandchildren and those of future generations that follow you is to have some understanding of how these events affected you or affected your family. The world that our children will inherit is far different than the world we knew. And so, as a result, are we composing a genealogical record for our children, for the future, and for those that follow? So, are we really giving them a full picture? We may be able to document the genetics, the migration of our ancestors to the Midwest. We may be able to link back several generations. But the full picture, that's a student that didn't even like my lecture on the sidewalk. Are we giving them a full picture of how life was like? So I took 1955, and I pull this off the internet, but here are some statements about 1955 in our lifetime. I'll tell you one thing, if things keep going the way they are, it's going to be impossible to buy a week's groceries for $10. That was in 1955. That's only, 70 years ago. Have you seen the new cars coming out next year? It won't be long before $1,000 will only buy a used one. See how things has changed and how our attitudes change. So one of the things that you might want to think about as you work on your genealogy is get some pictures. If you don't have them, get a picture of let's say you're doing 1940, get a picture of a 1940 car or a 1929 Model T to include, this is what we use for transportation. Or if your grandparents farmed with horses, a team of horses, and talk about how life was following a team of horses all day. If cigarettes keep going up in price, I'm going to quit. 20 cents a pack is ridiculous. This is an advertisement. I mean, that is pretty amazing. Did you hear the post office is thinking about charging 7 cents just to mail a letter? 70 years ago, 1955, people were complaining about the cost of postage. If they raise the minimum wage to $1, nobody will be able to hire outside help at the store. Some of you may have worked for $1 an hour. I remember my first job was $3 an hour. And I should write that down. I worked in 1970 for $3 an hour. And I thought I was living high on the hog, as they say. When I first started driving, who would have thought gas someday would cost 25 cents a gallon? Guess we'd be better off leaving the car in the garage. I was going to college in the gas rationing years of the early 70s, and some of you will remember that. Finding gas weekends was a problem. Since my parents and in-laws were farmers, I would fill up 2 5-gallon cans I'd fill up my car and 2 5-gallon cans out of the farm gas tank and put it in the back of my car so I'd have gas to drive back to college and have gas to get back home. Probably not the smartest thing, not the wisest thing in terms of hauling 10 gallons of gas in, but that's what I did. Those are the kind of stories, though, that I should be writing down and sharing with my grandchildren. I'm afraid to send my kids to movies anymore ever since they let Clark Gable get by with saying damn in the movie Gone with the Wind. It seems like every new movie has either hell or damn in it. Wouldn't we be so fortunate today if that was the worst language used? I read the other day where some scientist thinks it's possible to put a man on the moon by the end of the century. They even have some fellows they call astronauts preparing for it down in Texas. 70 years ago. Think about how our kids and grandkids will look back on this. Did you see where some baseball player just signed a contract for $50,000 a year to play ball? It wouldn't surprise me if someday they'll be making more than the president. Well, we have multi-million-dollar contracts today, 70 years later. I never thought today I'd see all of our kitchen appliances would be electric. They're even making electric typewriters now. So a few years ago, I had friends that had an adolescent daughter that wanted to be a journalist, and I'm a thrifter. I like to go to thrift stores. And she found a manual typewriter and fell in love with it. We were in Perry, Iowa. She bought it. Well, her mom bought it. And they asked me, and I think they gave $50 for, but she'd never seen a manual typewriter. And so they asked me if I would take it to the FedEx or someplace and have it shipped to Florida. It cost more to ship it than she paid for it. And this has probably been close to 20 years ago, but I seen her mother this past winter, and I said, say, does Olivia still have the typewriter? She says, oh, indeed. It's in her apartment in New York, where she's working as a model for a modeling agency in New York City, but she still has it. So the story of that typewriter is just an example of the kind of stories that you have that you should be putting in your genealogical records. It's too bad things are so tough nowadays. I see where a few married women are having to work outside of the home to make ends meet. Think about how that has changed in 70 years. It won't be long before young couples are going to have to hire someone to watch their kids so they both can work. That's here, isn't it? Most working couples have a nanny or child care to help raise their kids. I'm afraid that Volkswagen car is going to open a door to a whole lot of foreign business. In 1955, that was viewed as a threat. Now, it's sort of hard to distinguish what's foreign and what's U.S. made, but in 1955, some of you may have owned a Volkswagen. The drive-in restaurant is convenient in nice weather, but I seriously doubt they'll ever catch on. If we would all put our money in fast food in 1955, we'd be financially wealthy. You know, remember those first drive-ins? There's no sense going on short trips anymore for a weekend. It costs nearly $2 a night to stay in a hotel. Think how, and these are stories about vacationing and where you may vacation or where your grandparents vacationed. Nobody can afford to be sick anymore at $15 a day in the hospital. It's just too rich for my blood. My mother, who was a hoarder, actually had collected and kept the medical bills when there were 6 of us kids. I cost $15. That was the bill, and someplace in my stash I have it, But see, that was a lot of money, when $15. And here we've got, of course, a famous character getting a haircut. If they think, well, I'll pay 30 cents for a haircut, forget it. And in fact, I was in college before I ever went to a barber shop. My mother cut our hair. That was pretty common. I mean, that wasn't unique to us, but so the point I'm trying to get, and I'm watching the time here, is your world versus their world. Their world being your children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, in some cases, great great grandchildren. In our world, communication was writing letters and reliance on the postal service. Their world is texting and cell phone and social media through various internet providers. Our world was one of community-based. Because of the lack of transportation, much of the activities was around where we lived. Church, school, our playmates, it was all around community. Today, there's really no boundaries. People play games, electronic games. We had friends over the other night, and they explained to us that their adult daughter that lives with them wasn't able to come because she was playing Dungeons and Dragons on the internet with her boyfriend in Minneapolis. You know, a bit different. Family was clearly defined. We could recognize a family. I'm pretty good at observing what families are, but now with the blending of gender and sex roles, it's really, one has to acknowledge that multiple forms of family. Education, man, I had a standard curriculum from Scholar R1 High School in Queen City, Missouri. Today, education is individualized. We have the ability to individualize. In fact, I just seen on the news this morning, Iowa State's offering courses, short courses for college students. That's very attractive. In our world, the role of work, we viewed work formed a personality. Hard work was a measure of status. In the community that I was raised in, the harder you worked, the stronger you were, the better the person you were. Work defined our identity. That has changed. In their world, work provides income for a quality of life. Work provides income so that you can define yourself. So instead of the job defining who you are, it's oftentimes what you do in your leisure time. So I'm an accountant by daytime, but actually I'm a mountaineer, or I'm a rock climber, or I'm a professor during the day, but I'm a fiddler on weekends and evenings. And that's somewhat true now that I'm retired. But see how that's changed. This is part of documenting our world. Community participation was important. It was important. It was instilled in us. It was important to support the community. Community participation in their world is, what community are you talking about? Is it the community that I live in? Is it the community that I belong to on social media? In fact, research is showing that people are members of multiple communities, not just the physical community that they live in. Church and religion is undergoing a complete revolution. Church and religion were closely intertwined. Community, neighborhood churches were aligned, and rituals provided constancy and tradition over time. Today, personal relationships need not be in a corporate setting. Worship as an experience, not something that you have to do every Sunday. Many people, in fact, now the do not belong now outnumber church members. And we can see how that is changing across the landscape of the Midwest with small churches slowly withering. So as you supplement the nature part of your genealogical record with nurture, it might be useful to talk about some cataclysmic events that happened in your lifetime that shaped how you view the world, how it shaped your values, beliefs, and attitudes. And so I've included a few examples. Cataclysmic events, the assassination of presidents. I would guess if I were to ask you where you were at the day that President Kennedy was shot, you could tell me. You can tell me. Now, why is that? Earthquakes, the assassination of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, the 9/11 attack on the United States. How that changed people. Lynette and I had a guest in a few weeks ago to our apartment, a black man, and he moved from New York City. Is that right? Right. So I was curious. He moved from New York to Des Moines. The sociology came out in me. I can't control. I said, well, what on earth for? It was because of the bombing of 9/11. He loaded up his family and fled to Des Moines for safety. Mm-hmm. Personal traumas are also an example. Boy, when I talk to people, oftentimes they talk to me about before polio vaccine and they or a loved one was in an iron lung. You see iron lungs now. Pete, you were identified as one? You had that experience? Yeah. See, those are the things that the future generation needs to hear. Whether it's illness or death, most of you in this room will remember how it felt in the 1993 floods when Ames was underwater and with floods, and we couldn't get in or out of town unless you went north to Gilbert. Work expectations, the value of work and money. Other family structure and experiences. A very good friend of mine talks about, she's almost 90, she talks about her mother dying when she was 11 because somebody, she was never sure, somebody, instead of putting kerosene in the tank for the cook stove in their house, put gasoline in, and her mother tipped the canister up to light the stove, and of course it exploded and burned her, and she died when this little girl was 11. And she's now almost 90, and she still recalls the vivid details of that. Community and church events and experiences, and certainly school experiences. These are all things that shape our values and beliefs, and it provides a context for the nature part that you work so hard in demonstrating your family lineage. It's the social context, the nurturing part. With that, I'm going to quit. We can have a discussion. We've got time for questions, comments, thoughts, ideas. Yes, sir.
I'm coming to you with a microphone.
I wonder if you could talk about specialization of labor and how that might affect the way that the number of things that we have in common.
Oh, it's a good question. You know, so the specialization of labor, it seems to me that the big part of that is that we have often lost a lot of craftsmanship, and now we do task or piecemeal work. The specialization in manufacturing. So, and Henry Ford is called Fordism, where you no longer build a car, but you made one component or maybe only a piece of a component. When we look at agriculture, I think the specialization in farming has pulled us apart. The days of a general family farm that had both livestock and crops has given way to chicken farms or hogs farms or cattle feeding operation. So specialization has had dramatic influence on our commonality. I oftentimes talk about that we become a nation of special interest groups. As opposed to, so you can just simply look at agriculture, the general farm organizations have given way to commodity groups. We also see that with labor unions. So the specialization, I fear that the next big move, we don't hear a lot about it, but I think the next big challenge, especially for working people, we've talked a lot about mechanization in agriculture, but I think the next big threat is going to be artificial intelligence and replacing white collar workers with computers. You know, what we've seen thus far has been a replacement of blue collar workers with machines. I really didn't want to do that kind of work anyway. But what happens when accounting and lawyers and doctors are machines? And that's going to have a huge impact on how middle class or white collar workers view specialization. Yeah, good question. And one that I don't know that I have an answer to it, but my observation is that's the next frontier is artificial intelligence. That replace people like me. I was on the faculty. I earned my living giving lectures. Now, students can get probably better lectures than I deliver on the internet. And somebody's going to come up and say, you know, we're going to teach this course that Paul Lasley's taught, except now we're going to have, instead of one lecture, we're going to have a series of lectures spread across the semester. So we really don't need Paul. You know, we just need a big screen TV in an auditorium. Yeah, great question.
I was working at.
Hold on 1 second.
Megan.
I was working at a place with a lot of younger people and many were students. And I said, how are you, getting back and forth to class from here? The bus doesn't come all the way out here. And they say, I don't go for class. I do everything online. And man, I was driving from Montour, Iowa into Iowa State, and it was a huge hurdle to get to Ames, to take the commuter bus and, during the winter, just to get a degree. And they don't have that hurdle anymore.
Yeah.
If they can do it online. But I just wanted to comment, I kind of came of age in the early 80s when inflation was 18%. That was a really big deal, and people don't realize, what a huge obstacle that was for a few years. And then I was studying agriculture and the farm debt crisis hit, and it totally changed my life. It changed my view towards employment, that if you get a job, you damn well better keep it, no matter how bad it was. And when I got laid off in Tama County in 1984, I made a 8-hour day out of knocking on doors looking for work, and there just wasn't anything, not waitress, not anything. And I remember there was a farmer in Chelsea who had 12 kids and took his life. It was just so devastating. And it was bad. And then the casino came in and everything's different there. But there has to be an economic base.
Yeah. And those stories that you just recounted, those 6 or 8 stories of your education and the barriers to education, the financial stress of the 80s.
And working for $3.38 an hour at a nursing home in 1984.
But those now have shaped who you are. And you need to record that as part of your genealogy record, how it was in the 1980s. Now, I told Lynette I wasn't going to wander off into this, but I will wander off just a little bit. For those of you that have studied genetics, we understand genetics, chromosomes and genes, but there's a new branch of genetics that I think is a frontier of genetic research, and it's called epigenetics. And if you haven't read or studied anything about epigenetics, but it's how the social conditions get incorporated into your genetic fiber that is then passed on to your children and grandchildren. I think that is, maybe my excitement about it is because it confirms what I've always thought. The experiences of my great-great-grandfather, not only his genetic material do I carry, but I carry a part of his life experiences. And in the animal world, we know this as evolution, we know this as survival of the fittest. Experiences of our parents and grandparents become incorporated into our well-being. And it's sort of the frontier of science. Yeah. But epigenetics. Thank you for sharing that. Other ideas, questions?
The idea.
Now Megan's gonna whack you with that if you don't straighten up.
So the idea of epigenetics really fascinates me. If I could go back to being a student, that's what I would study. And the, kind of the first good research on it is with soybeans, where they look at soybean seed developed under stress conditions and that it actually affects the genetics of the seed.
Mhm.
And it got me to thinking, there's a lot of kind of weird stuff in my family of like mental illnesses.
Mhm.
And as I do genetic research, I found that there were some real traumatic things with, like in my two-time great-grandfather was a prisoner in Civil War, had to stand guard at the hanging of the Sioux in Mankato, and was in Andersonville prison where most of his comrades died of disease. He survived, but died 10 years later from diseases related to it. And nobody in the family even knows about it. It was never passed along.
It was not recorded.
People, just live in the day, look forward. They tried to make a nice life for the young girl. And my grandma had no interest, knew nothing at all about what her grandfather had gone through. And then another grandfather had been in World War I in some of those horrific battles, and that's got to affect them. And so I've got this theory running, and I'm wondering if any of you have family experiences that where an ancestor was in just some horrible severe trauma, and if that ended up getting passed along somehow, even though it was never talked about. I had no idea that my grandfather was in those kind of battles because he never ever talked about it.
Yeah, I'll let Megan have it. I've got my own private one here. But thank you for that.
When I look at my genetics, my past lives of people in my family, I look at how many of their children died young, how many of the women died young, and they got married again. There's several marriages because the women would die in childbirth or something. It's just completely different lifestyle than what I think of now. Yeah, it's just different than what I think of now. Everybody's going to live till they're 80, and that's or till they've gone through their life and had their children and raised their children. But that's different than what we live through now.
And so if we can make a concentrated effort to record some of these factors that shape who we are, for those that follow. Pete?
Well, to follow up on that comment right there, yes, I can do that. But I wasn't smart enough growing up to ask the right questions. You know, what happened?
Isn't that the truth?
What did my folks do during the Depression? I'm not sure what happened. But then we go forward. Thank goodness for computers that I can look and see in general what happened to other people that have that same issue.
That's right. So we may not have a personal story. We may not know how our parents or grandparents responded, but we can go back in the literature, like these pictures here. There was not a family member there, but I could identify my grandparents or great grandparents, and it provides a context. Now, I don't know the specifics of my grandparents because, like you, I wasn't smart enough to ask.
I asked, but they wouldn't talk.
Well, and there's always that, but at least we can get some context of what it was like in their childhood, because our grandchildren and great grandchildren, they have trouble understanding the environment that we were raised in the 20th century, let alone how things were in the 18th or 19th century. You know, and my grandson thinks I'm over 100. You know, in the eyes of a 10-year-old. Yeah, good question, good statement. Other questions? I see Megan beginning to pace. I don't know what that means.
I was just making sure there were no questions online.
Well, you
Just to thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your attendance. I hope this will inspire you to write some stories about the social, economic, political factors that impacted you. That's part of your genealogical record. Thank you.